Hello and welcome to the Presbyterian Women's Bible Study coming to you from Black Mountain Presbyterian Church. This is the fourth lesson in the series, What My Grandmothers Taught Me. I have the other lessons in the series, and actually even last year's series are on the Black Mountain Presbyterian Church's YouTube channel, so I invite you to check those out if you're interested. Let's begin in prayer. Creating and loving God, as we read your word together, may we allow it to read us. As we enter into your story, may we understand our own stories with more clarity and wisdom. Help us to remember that you have always worked through the lives of ordinary women and men with all their faults and failings, people like us. We bring our ordinary lives before you today. Transform our expectations so that as we study stories of the past, we may be open to your extraordinary future. Amen. So this month we're looking at Ruth, and we'll continue studying her in next month's lesson as well. Now, her story's very familiar to a lot of us, but I think it deserves a closer look than perhaps we've given to her before. In this first lesson, we'll hear about famine, loss, and loyal love, the chesed that Ruth shows to her widowed mother-in-law. Now, Ruth's story starts with a narrator giving us the background, naming the main characters and setting the scene. I'm reading from the first chapter of Ruth, verses 1 through 7. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other named Ruth. After they'd lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. So Naomi and her family are refugees from the famine in their homeland. Naomi's husband dies, her 2 sons marry, and then 10 years later, both sons have died. The women are now childless, widowed, and depending on each other. The famine in Naomi's home has ended, so she's preparing to return with her daughters-in-law to Judah. So I ask, have you or your family left your home to find a better future in a strange new place? How did you feel when you arrived? How long did it take to feel at home there? You might want to pause the video to ask those questions. We sometimes describe the United States as a nation of immigrants, but many of us have really deep roots in a particular place. I mean, I was born within just a few miles of every one of my great-grandparents. But according to recent studies, the average American changes residences 11 times or more during their life. Almost all of us now know the feeling of landing in a new place and then leaving that home for yet another new one. Now, we might think of relocating as moving towards a better life, but Naomi's a refugee running away, escaping from desperate times, escaping famine in Judah, and now going back to her home place as a childless widow. But at least she has some family there. Orpah and Ruth are also childless widows, but to stay with Naomi means leaving their home place, going to a strange new land. Although they might help to support Naomi, she understands the burden it places on them. I'll read again. This is from the first chapter of Ruth, verses 8 through 15. Then Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you've shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed him goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I'm too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand is turned against me." At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law's going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." Ruth and Orpah seem to have started the journey with Naomi without question. I mean, they had married into Naomi's family, and they had been part of it for 10 years, so even now that they were widows, they were still attached to that family. But Naomi releases them from any obligation they might feel, encouraging them to return to their birth families and find husbands among their own people. She understands the pain Orpah and Ruth will have in leaving their homeland. And this is clearly a woman's story. Naomi calls Orpah and Ruth daughters. She encourages them to return to your mother's house, although the father would most certainly have been the head of household. And Naomi asks that the Lord show chesed to them as they had shown chesed both to the dead and to her. Now, we talked about chesed in our last lesson, that it's a Hebrew word. It's difficult to translate, as it's often called steadfast love or loving kindness, but keep your eyes out because it's going to come up again. Now, the women insist that they'll travel with Naomi, so she again urges them to stay where they are. She understands that levirate law, that it's impossible for her to provide husbands for Ruth and Orpah, and if they stay among their own people, unattached to Naomi's family, they're much more likely to find a suitable husband. Orpah finally accepts Naomi's very reasonable arguments and does the right thing by returning home, which highlights the exceptional devotion that Ruth shows to Naomi. And Ruth makes a striking declaration. Now, I usually favor Bible translations that focus on making the language clear and accessible for modern ears, but the language of Ruth's declaration to Naomi in the King James Version is just undeniable poetry. And Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee, for whither thou goest I will go, and where thou lodgest I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. Now, Ruth is using a form of an oath. It's the closing line of a typical Near East oath formula. May the Lord do thus and so with me, and more also, if even death parts me from you. It seals the vow, and it makes it unbreakable. What do you think about the idea of an unbreakable vow? Is it realistic? How do you recognize it? Have you ever made one? Feel free to pause the video to discuss those questions. Ruth and Naomi finally arrive in Judah just as the barley harvest is beginning. They're tired, hungry, no resources beside the hesed that they've shown to each other. In chapter 2 of Ruth, we see a little window of hope opening up. Since the harvest is just beginning, Ruth will be able to go into the fields and glean once the harvesters have left them. Now, our study book author compares this ancient practice to dumpster diving, searching for usable bits of food that are left after those with resources have taken what they want. Ruth's a foreigner. She's not under the protection of any man. She's bravely going into fields to provide for herself and Naomi. She doesn't realize it, but she begins gleaning in a field that belongs to Boaz, a clansman of Naomi's family. She catches his eye. She's working hard. She doesn't stop. He hears about this hard work, and he hears about how she's cared for Naomi. See how Ruth and Boaz deal with each other. I'm reading from verses 8 through 18. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you're thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you didn't know before. May the Lord repay you for what you've done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take refuge." "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You've put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread, dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted, and he had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. "Let her gather among the sheaves, and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some of the stalks for her from the bundles and leave them there for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had had left over after she had eaten enough. Now, by the way, an ephah is roughly equivalent to about a bushel. So a bushel of threshed grain, that's a pretty good haul for a day's work. What strikes you about the interaction between Ruth and Boaz? Boaz seems to be a man of some means, and he speaks to Ruth from a position of authority. He's kind, but paternally. I mean, he calls her daughter. He also refers to Ruth having come for refuge under the wings of the Lord, the God of Israel. That phrase, under the wings of, that will come to have even more impact for next month's lesson. But for now, we can reflect on how Ruth responds to Boaz's words, praising his actions, and using that word chesed again. You have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant. Now, chesed is a noun, but it requires practical action on behalf of another. To quote one scholar, chesed describes something that happens within an existing relationship, whether it's between two human beings or between a human being and God. In human relationships, chesed implies loving our neighbor not just merely in terms of warm emotional feelings, but in tangible acts of love and service. Rahab showed chesed to the spies in Jericho. Ruth showed chesed to Naomi, and Boaz, the son of Rahab, showed chesed to Ruth. So I ask you, where have seeds of hope been brought into your dark moments? Who brought those seeds? And did you recognize them at the time, or only in looking back? The second chapter of Ruth closes with verses 19 through 23. Ruth and Naomi are together. They're talking over the day's events. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." And then Ruth told her mother-in-law, the name of the man I worked with today is Boaz. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. I'm reminded of conversations I've had with my daughters. So what happened today? Was it busy at work? How'd the gleaning go? After Ruth gives her report, Naomi fills her in. Boaz is a kinsman, and he can be trusted to keep Ruth safe. In fact, he is one of Naomi's guardian redeemers, and we'll find out more about that position in our next lesson. But this lesson is touched on topics that are on the front line of current events. At its heart, this lesson is about a family bond that extends beyond simple biology. Here's some questions touching on this lesson for you to consider and discuss. I encourage you to pause the video and take your time to do so. Has this lesson impacted your feelings about refugees, immigration, food insecurity? What's your experience with extended families, the family bonds that we intentionally forge or that seem to grow on their own? What relationships have you seen where in-laws, dear friends, or distant relatives are fully integrated into the family? What was the context, the situation that allowed those relationships to form? Now, we know that Ruth can gather food for her small family in safety. The famine in the hearts and arms of Naomi and Ruth is not over, but they have hope. They're forging a connection with Boaz, and he is a man of chesed. Let's close with prayer. God of the outsider, let me stand with Ruth when I sense my own difference or that of another. Help me to see through the closed shutters of preconceived ideas or of my own helplessness to the small kindnesses of strangers. When I'm stuck in my small world, let Ruth bring me to a wider space where I can see the worth of every person. Most of all, let me never underestimate the power of ordinary goodness, and let me live this in every ordinary moment. Amen. Thanks for watching, and go in peace.